Before there were pages, before printing presses or film reels, the stories of a civilization were carved into stone. In the ancient world, few cultures held the human form in such divine esteem as the Greeks. To them, the body was not simply a vessel. It was a temple, a reflection of harmony, order, and the gods themselves. And at the heart of this philosophy stood the sculptor, half craftsman, half philosopher, and wholly essential to shaping the legacy of Greece. Walk through the ruins of Athens, Sparta, Delphi, or Olympia, and you'll find echoes of these silent artisans everywhere. Marble statues with their polished brows and curled lips still whisper secrets of forgotten kings and imagined deities. But for every piece that survived, hundreds more have been lost to time, melted down for war, smashed by conquerors, or simply left to crumble. What remains, however, tells a tale not only of art, but of obsession. Because behind each flawless curve and anatomical perfection was a grueling process, physical, mental, and spiritual, that consumed years of a sculptor's life. To chisel stone was to chase immortality. Imagine a sun-soaked workshop overlooking the Aegean Sea, its wooden beams darkened by time and dusted with powdered marble. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of sweat oil and crushed stone. The rasp of metal against rock creates a rhythm more ancient than music. It is here, in these humble, chaotic spaces, that Greek sculptors wrestled with nature to create visions of the divine. But how did these artisans begin their journey? What did it mean to live a life shaping gods from mountains? To understand ancient Greek sculpture, you must first understand the deep reverence the Greeks had for balance, symmetry, and proportion. Their religion was built on a pantheon of gods who were human in appearance and temperament. Their philosophy idolized harmony, and their democracy was at its core a celebration of individual greatness. So when a sculptor was commissioned to craft a statue of Athena, of a victorious athlete, of a fallen hero, it wasn't just about capturing beauty. It was about channeling the soul of a city, immortalizing an ideal, and honoring forces greater than man. These weren't nameless laborers. In fact, many sculptors were respected in their time, some even becoming celebrities. Names like Phidias, Praxiteles, and Polykletos were known across city-states. Their workshops teemed with apprentices, patrons, and pieces in progress. When Phidias sculpted the towering statue of Zeus at Olympia, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, he wasn't just building a figure. He was attempting to carve godhood into existence. For the Greeks, this was sacred work. But don't let the elegance of the final pieces fool you. Sculpting in ancient Greece was backbreaking labor. Imagine spending days under a scorching Mediterranean sun, striking a block of marble taller than yourself, measuring every stroke against a wax model or a rough sketch. Each chip, each flake, was an irreversible choice. There was no undo button, no safety net. And mistakes weren't just personal failures, they were seen as offenses to the gods and patrons who had entrusted you with their vision. Most statues began not with marble, but with clay. Sculptors would shape the figure in miniature, using beeswax or terracotta testing proportions and poses. They studied anatomy obsessively, often dissecting animals or observing athletes to understand muscle tension and motion. Only once the model was perfect did the stone carving begin. The raw marble was transported from quarries, sometimes from islands like Paros or Naxos, and moved with teams of oxen ropes and sheer willpower. And then, slowly, day by day, a form would emerge from the rock. And yet, despite their sweat and skill, sculptors were not always free men. Many were slaves or metics foreigners who lived in Greek cities without full citizenship. Others were independent craftsmen who had to balance passion with pragmatism, taking commissions that paid the bills rather than stirred the soul. But regardless of status, All sculptors shared a common belief that through their hands stone could breathe, that cold marble could sing of love, war victory, and eternity. Even more than temples or epic poem sculpture was how ancient Greece told its story. Cities competed for the most beautiful statues to line their agoras. Families commissioned grave reliefs to honor the dead. And every major festival included some form of sculptural offering, whether it was a statue of Nike to celebrate a battle or a bust of a philosopher to mark a public speech. To be a sculptor was to sit at the crossroads of faith politics and aesthetics. Your hands shaped not just stone, but memory itself. And perhaps that's why these statues still haunt us. Though chipped and weathered, many retain their power. A tilt of the head, a gaze frozen in time, a hand resting gently on a knee. These moments feel alive. They remind us that thousands of years ago, someone cared deeply about form and feeling. Someone stood in a workshop, sweat dripping down their spine, whispering prayers to Athena as they traced a shoulder blade into stone. This was the ancient Greek sculptor. Not just an artist, but a bridge between the mortal and the eternal. Between what was and what would be remembered. No one was born a master. In ancient Greece, before a sculptor could ever breathe life into marble or forge a god from bronze, he had to serve quietly, humbly, and often invisibly. Behind every breathtaking statue that has survived the centuries stood years of bruised fingers, blistered palms, and quiet obedience. For those drawn to the sculptor's path, greatness began not with a chisel, but with watching, listening, and waiting. Imagine being a boy of 10 or 11, too young to wield a hammer, but old enough to carry buckets of water, sweep marble dust from the workshop floor, and stare in awe at the brawny arms and delicate hands of the masters around you. Perhaps your father was a stonemason. Perhaps you were the son of a potter or a carpenter, hoping to rise in a world that still measured status by skill. If you were lucky or tenacious, you'd be brought into a sculptor's workshop as an apprentice. And just like that, your world would change forever. Workshops or ergosteria were more than places of labor. They were temples of transformation. Inside these spaces, the sounds of instruction, concentration, and creation filled the air from sunrise to sunset. The master sculptor Technites was more than a teacher. He was a gatekeeper to divine beauty, a mediator between raw stone and eternal form. And for his apprentices, the journey was long and unforgiving. The first years were all about observation and grunt work. You wouldn't be carving a statue anytime soon. Your days were spent fetching tools, mixing clay, preparing pigments, heating wax, cleaning the stone chips, and organizing materials. You learned through proximity, through repetition, through the rhythms of labor passed down by generations. There were no manuals, no schools in the modern sense. The workshop was your classroom, and mistakes were punished by embarrassment or worse, expulsion. And yet slowly, the deeper lessons began to reveal themselves. As your hands grew calloused and your eyes sharpened, you began to grasp the mathematics hidden within the human body, the golden ratios, the sacred symmetry. You studied the great works of past masters, not in museums, but in pieces scattered across temples, shrines, and graves. You learned that a god's shoulder should never be as broad as his hips, that a warrior's legs must convey both strength and grace, and that a mother's expression could be softened with the slightest shift in a marble cheekbone. Art in ancient Greece was not about copying nature, it was about elevating it. Sculptors weren't trying to recreate a man or a woman as they appeared on the street. They aimed to portray them as they could be, as they should be. Idealized, purified, balanced. And you, the apprentice, had to absorb this philosophy until it lived in your fingertips. As your skills grew, the master might allow you to practice shaping simple forms, an ear, a toe, a piece of drapery. He'd hand you a mallet and chisel, not with pride, but with caution. You'd sit beside more experienced assistants, imitating their every movement. Marble, once intimidating, began to feel familiar. You learned how to strike without splintering, how to listen for the stone's resistance, how to read its veins like a map. You were being trained not just in technique, but in patience. Sculpting demanded time, sometimes years, for a single statue. And your role often was to help build someone else's masterpiece before you ever touched your own. The lessons extended beyond stone. A sculptor needed to understand human anatomy, architecture, religion, and storytelling. You studied the epics Homer's Iliad, the Odyssey, the hymns to the gods. You memorized the postures of heroes, the emblems of deities, the meaning behind every spear shield and fold of a robe. You watched real athletes train in the gymnasiums to study how muscle contracts and limbs extend. You examined elderly bodies to learn the truth of aging flesh. The human form in all its complexity was your lifelong obsession. But make no mistake, the workshop was not a utopia. Jealousy brewed among apprentices. Tempers flared when tools were misplaced or credit was stolen. Some students were relatives of the master and received special attention. Others, especially those from poorer families or foreign backgrounds, had to work twice as hard just to be noticed. And for those apprenticed through debt or bondage, freedom was not promised. Even genius couldn't guarantee your name would ever be remembered. Yet even in the shadows, there was something sacred about the process. Apprentices formed quiet brotherhoods. They whispered dreams of fame while carving fingers and noses. They competed, joked, grieved, and sometimes rebelled. Every day brought new lessons, new frustrations, new hopes. And when at last your master allowed you to sign your name tiny chiseled at the base of a statue, you knew you had crossed an invisible threshold. You were no longer a servant of stone. You were its interpreter. Some never made it that far. Others became assistants for life, forever shaping limbs for someone else's vision. But for the few who endured, who learned to turn dust into drama, who could see the divine in the curve of a spine or the tension in a wrist, the reward was transcendence. They became the silent authors of Greek memory. And centuries later, we still see their fingerprints. Every great sculptor in ancient Greece was only as powerful as the materials in his hands. Talent mattered. Vision mattered. But without the right stone, the right clay, the right metal, nothing could come to life. In a world without mass production, every tool was made by hand, every material carried from miles away, and every choice carried weight. These weren't just substances to be carved or melted. They were the foundation of immortality. At the heart of Greek sculpture stood marble, white, luminous, and nearly sacred. To the ancient eye, marble was more than a rock. It was a living thing, breathing under sunlight, catching shadows in its curves. The most prized marble came from specific places, Paros known for its flawless, translucent stone, Naxos with its pearly gray veins, and the Pentelic quarries near Athens, whose golden hue glowed as if kissed by the gods. Transporting these blocks was a Herculean task. Imagine hauling several tons of marble across mountain paths, loading them onto ships with ropes and rollers, then dragging them through bustling city streets to the sculptor's workshop. Before the first chisel ever touched the surface, months, sometimes years, were spent just getting the stone into place. And marble was merciless. One wrong strike could ruin everything. It chipped, it cracked, it split. Sculptors had to know their stone like a lover, where it was soft, where it was brittle, where the veins ran thick like frozen rivers. Before carving, the artist would walk around the block, touch it, even listen to it. Some said the stone spoke to them, and perhaps in a way it did. But marble wasn't the only medium. Before carving began, most sculptors started with clay soft forgiving and wonderfully alive. Clay allowed artists to explore form triposes and understand balance without the terrifying permanence of stone. Wax was also used especially for small figures, or as a layer over clay to create finer detail. These early models were the blueprints for greatness. They weren't rough sketches, they were sculptures in their own right, sometimes taking weeks to perfect. And in the hands of a master, clay moved like flesh. A simple gesture, the turn of a head or twist of a torso, could change the entire emotion of a statue. This was where the real art began, not in the stone, but in the mind's rehearsal. Then there was bronze, the metal of heroes. Unlike marble, bronze could catch the light like fire. It was warm, strong, and seemingly eternal. Sculptors who worked in bronze were not only artists, but engineers. The process was daunting, risky, and expensive. First came the wax model, detailed and delicate. This was covered in clay, then heated until the wax melted away, leaving a perfect mold. This was the famous lost wax technique. Next, molten bronze melted at over 1,000 degrees Celsius was poured into the mold, filling every curve, every line. Once cooled, the outer shell was cracked away, and the real work began: sanding, polishing, assembling. Bronze allowed for daring poses and extended limbs that marble couldn't support. It gave sculptors a new language, one of movement, tension, and raw energy. Statues like the Rias warriors or the charioteer of Delphi seemed to leap from their base's muscles, alive with motion. But bronze had its price. It was expensive. It required fuel-fire manpower. And during times of war, many statues were melted down to make weapons, coins, or armor. As a result, while marble statues filled temples and tombs, bronze statues were rarer and their survival even more miraculous. Then came the tools, the humble, precious extensions of the sculptor's will. Chisels of varying sizes, mallets of olive wood, rasps, drills, and abrasives made from emery or sand. There were flat chisels for shaping, point chisels for rough cuts, and round chisels for subtle curves. Bronze tools were common early on, but as iron and steel spread sharper, stronger instruments became available. Some sculptors even used string drills spun with bows to hollow out eyes, mouths, or curls of hair. Each tool had its purpose, and mastering them was an art in itself. In careless hands, they were weapons. In the hands of a master, they were wands. But no matter the material or tool, every step was rooted in patience. Sculptors often worked barefoot to feel the floor, to ground themselves. They wore tunics or loincloths, their bodies dusted white by the constant carving. Their workshops smelled of oil smoke and stone. The rhythm of their chisels echoed like prayers through the air. And while statues may have begun in clay or stone, they were completed in silence, refined over months, sometimes years, until every line, every shadow, every fingertip aligned with the sculptor's vision. Materials didn't just define what could be made, they defined how it would be remembered. A statue in marble was a whisper to the gods. A figure in bronze was a challenge to time. A model in clay was a glimpse into genius. The Greeks didn't separate their art from their materials, they honored them. Because in the end, marble and bronze weren't just tools. They were co-creators in the eternal conversation between human and divine. Not every masterpiece began with inspiration. Often, it began with a knock on the workshop door. In ancient Greece, sculpture wasn't just about personal expression. It was business, religion, politics, and power. Behind every statue was a patron, someone with money, purpose, and often ego. A sculptor's hands may have shaped the stone, but the idea that usually came from someone else, someone with a vision of how they wanted to be remembered, worshipped, or feared. Clients ranged from powerful city-states to humble families. A wealthy merchant might commission a statue of himself draped in a toga offering, thanks to the gods for a successful voyage. A grieving mother might request a grave stele to honor her child, captured forever in a simple, solemn pose. Entire cities hired sculptors to immortalize their victories, military, athletic, or moral. The gods were often the focus, but make no mistake, these were offerings laced with human ambition, dedications to Athena. Apollo or Zeus were meant to earn favor, not just piety, but prosperity. When a patron walked into a sculptor's workshop, negotiations began. There was no catalog to flip through, no menu of options. Everything was custom. Everything was symbolic. Size mattered. Was this a life-sized figure or something towering and divine? Materials mattered. Marble cost dearly. Bronze even more. Then came posture, attire, expression. Should the subject appear youthful and strong, wise and serene, godlike or mortal? Every detail was weighed and argued. Sculptors had to be part artist, part diplomat. They needed to interpret a client's desire while staying true to the ideals of form and proportion. But sculptors didn't only serve individuals. They were essential tools of the state. In Athens, for example, after military victories, citizens would pool resources to commission statues of Nike, the winged goddess of victory, or of generals and hoplites who led them. These statues didn't just decorate public spaces. They told a story. They sent messages. We are powerful. We are just. We are favored by the gods. Sculpture became propaganda in marble, designed to impress allies and intimidate enemies. Temples, too, were massive clients. The greatest commissions in Greek history came from sacred precincts. The Parthenon wasn't just a temple, it was an artistic revolution. Phidias, the sculptor entrusted with the enormous chryselephantine statue of Athena inside, was not just a craftsman. He was a visionary, managing an entire team. His job was not only to create a physical form, but to capture the spirit of a city in a single gaze, a single stance. And for that, he was paid handsomely, though his fame also drew enemies and accusations of impiety and theft. Sometimes the sculptor had more freedom. A small village might commission a statue, but leave the composition up to the artist's judgment. In such cases, the sculptor could weave in hidden meanings, subtle innovations, or personal touches. But even then, he had to remain within the cultural lines. Deviating too far from the expected form, especially when depicting gods, could be seen as disrespectful, even blasphemous. You couldn't make Apollo fat or show Hera in tattered clothes. The Greeks believed beauty was divine order made visible. To distort that order was to provoke the wrath of heaven and earth. Still, creative freedom found ways to slip through the cracks. One sculptor might subtly adjust the tilt of a head to convey melancholy. Another might craft a hand gesture that hinted at inner conflict. These weren't just statues, they were silent narratives. Sculptors knew that body language spoke louder than stone. A clenched fist could suggest rage. A slight turn of the foot could suggest motion. And a blank expression, paradoxically, could carry the weight of 1,000 emotions. Payment came in many forms: coins, livestock, wine, or political favor. Some sculptors gained land. Others received citizenship in the cities they served. A few, especially those who created monumental works for temples, had their names carved into the base of the statues, a rare honor, a mark of artistic immortality. But glory was fickle. Sculptors walked a narrow line between fame and danger. Praise could turn to jealousy. Success could bring scrutiny. In some cases, artists were accused of sacrilege if a statue was seen as too sensual, too unconventional, or too proud. A sculptor might be jailed, exiled, or even killed for offending a powerful patron or priest. For all its elegance, the world of Greek sculpture was a battlefield of ego ideology and faith. Yet for many artists, the risk was worth it. Because with every commission, they weren't just earning coin, they were shaping legacy. They knew that statues outlived speeches, that marble endured long after empires fell. To be chosen as the hand that carved a god's image was to be entrusted with more than stone. It was to be entrusted with memory. And so when the hammer struck the first blow, it wasn't just the beginning of a statue. It was the birth of a story, one whispered across generations, carried on the breath of history, and sealed forever in silence. The block of marble sat in silence, cold and unyielding, untouched by time or emotion. To the untrained eye, it was nothing a hunk of rock, but to the sculptor, it was potential. Hidden beneath its pale surface was a god waiting to be born. The sculptor didn't just see the stone, he saw through it. And what followed was not merely a craft, but a ritual, a slow, sacred dance between man and matter. Every statue began long before the first chisel was lifted. The process started in the sculptor's mind with an idea, a vision, or a commission. But vision alone wasn't enough. The sculptor would sketch rough designs on wax tablets, discuss proportions with assistants, and build a clay model called a plastos. This small, soft version of the statue was a critical step. It allowed the sculptor to shape form, freely experiment with posture and perfect balance. In many cases, a full-size clay model followed, acting as a 1:1 blueprint for the marble figure to come. This was not improvisation. It was a calculated sequence honed by generations of tradition. With the model ready, the sculptor approached the marble. He did not rush. He circled it, studied it. Under shifting light, traced its surface with calloused fingers. Every vein, every fault line was noted. Marble, for all its beauty, could betray you. A hidden crack could snap a limb mid-carve. One wrong strike, and weeks of work vanished in an instant. So before the first cut, the sculptor measured and marked with charcoal or red ochre, mapping out his battlefield. Then came the first blow. The point chisel, held at an angle and struck with a wooden mallet, was the primary tool in the roughing out phase. This was the loudest, most violent part of the process, huge chips flying off. In bursts, reducing the block to a rough silhouette. The sculptor worked from all sides, carving down to basic shapes, a curve for the head, a bulge for the shoulder, a dip where the knee would be. At this stage, the statue was still crude, ghost-like, but the form had begun. Next, the toothed chisel entered the scene. Like a rake of sharp fangs, it scraped across the marble, refining edges and smoothing planes. Here, the statue started to emerge. In earnest, muscles began to ripple garments, draped eyes took shape. But even now, the process demanded patience. The sculptor didn't just sculpt flesh, he sculpted gravity, tension, emotion. A twist of the torso conveyed power. A raised eyebrow whispered defiance. This was where stone stopped being stone and started to become story. For the finest details, the sculptor used flat chisels, rasps, and abrasives made from powdered pumice or emery. Fingernails, eyelids, curls of hair, these were carved with tenderness, often by candlelight or reflected sunlight. The skin was polished to a soft sheen, not too shiny, just enough to feel alive. Some statues were even coated with a thin layer of wax or painted with mineral pigments, reds, blues, golds, to give lifelike tones to lips, eyes, and clothing. What we see today, bleached white figures stripped by centuries, was once vibrant, dramatic, almost startling. For large statues or complicated compositions, sculptors sometimes worked in sections. Arms heads or weapons were carved separately and attached using metal dowels and mortar. It allowed for easier handling and more intricate poses. And in some rare cases, statues included inlays, ivory for skin glass, for eyes, even real jewels for crowns and accessories. These weren't just statues, they were illusions of divinity caught between sculpture and stagecraft. Throughout the process, the sculptor never worked alone. Workshops were teams. Apprentices smoothed surfaces, assistants handled measurements, porters moved pieces, and sometimes priests oversaw the spiritual appropriateness of a pose. But the final decisions, the soul of the statue belonged to the master. His eye guided every curve. His hand made the final stroke. And when the work was done after months, even years, the statue stood tall and silent, as if it had always existed. The sculptor would step back, breathless, not with exhaustion, but awe. Not because he believed he'd made something beautiful, but because he'd revealed something that was already there. He hadn't forced the stone, he had freed it. This moment, quiet and still, was the sculptor's reward. Not applause, not payment, not fame, but the knowledge that he had summoned the eternal from the ephemeral, that he had spoken to the gods in the only language they respected: creation. Some statues would be placed in temples, others in public squares or private gardens. Some would become symbols of cities, others forgotten in dusty corners. But wherever they stood, they carried a piece of their maker, not just in signature, but in spirit. A single statue could outlive its creator by millennia. And even when time wore down its features, even when hands and heads were lost, the presence remained. Because sculpture in ancient Greece was never just about form. It was about belief. It was about giving shape to things unseen. Honor grief, victory, love, vengeance, divinity. And no matter how many chisels dulled or how much marble fell to dust, the sculptor's purpose remained: to make the invisible visible. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft amber light over the tiled rooftops of the city, but the workshop was already alive. A sculptor's day didn't begin with poetry or divine inspiration. It began with dust sweat and the sound of footsteps crunching gravel. In the quiet of the early morning, before the agora stirred and the temples echoed with prayer, the heart of creation beat not in marble halls, but in cramped rooms, heavy with the smell of stone. The ergasterion, the sculptor's workshop, was no grand studio. It was a functional space, more warehouse than gallery, filled with chaos and rhythm. Some were freestanding buildings on the outskirts of the city. Others were tucked behind temples or near the marble yards. Inside, the walls were rough, the air dry, and the light filtered through narrow windows or open roofs. There was no silence here, only the constant hum of labor of men and boys and tools in motion. At the center of the space stood the marble, great blocks. Some taller than a man, loomed like sleeping giants. Some had been half-shaped already, their forms emerging like memories from the stone. Others were untouched, waiting to be judged, measured, marked. Nearby tables held rows of chisels, sharp and worn, alongside copper tools, string lines, wax models, and polished pebbles used for smoothing. Buckets of water sat in corners, often cloudy with marble dust. Clay pots, broken and whole, were scattered about, some used to carry pigments, others to mix glues, wax or lime. The workers arrived in waves. Apprentices came first, young boys, still smelling of sleep, their eyes wide and fingers quick. Their tasks were menial, but essential. They fetched water from wells, swept chips of marble into piles, kept the tools clean, and watched. Always watched the movements of the more experienced men. Their arms bore scratches, their tunics stained white, but their minds were sponges, soaking up every word, every gesture. Then came the assistants men, who had trained for years and now handled significant portions of the carving. These were the ones who transformed clay models into real stone measuring ratios, roughing out forms, perfecting symmetry. They worked in focused silence sleeves, rolled sandals, dusty brows furrowed. You could tell how long someone had been in the trade by the way they held their chisel tight for the new relaxed for the seasoned. Their hands were as hard as the stone they shaped. The master sculptor arrived last. His presence didn't demand attention, it commanded it by nature. He moved slowly, his eye scanning every inch of the room. He didn't shout instructions. A glance, a nod. A raised brow was enough. His reputation often preceded him. Patrons, priests, and magistrates sometimes visited just to watch him work or to whisper new commissions. Yet despite the reverence, he was just another pair of hands once the tools were picked up. The day unfolded in a ritual of rhythm. There was no clock, only sun and instinct. First came the measurements aligning the day's work with yesterday's progress. Assistants compared the clay model to the stone using plumb lines, calipers, and points transferred with string and wax. Some even used a wooden framework around the block to ensure exact symmetry. Then came the sound, the unmistakable cadence of metal meeting stone. Tap, tap, crack. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. The workshop sang its music, not beautiful, but hypnotic. It echoed off the walls out into the street where passers-by could tell which stage the statue was in just by listening. Neighbors often complained about the noise, but none denied the workshop's importance. For many, it was the soul of the neighborhood, a place where gods were born and heroes remembered. The smell was distinct, a mix of dust sweat, hot wax olive oil, and the faint tang of bronze shavings. When polishing began, the scent of crushed pumice joined the mix. When pigments were applied, a richer aroma of minerals, charcoal, and beeswax floated through the air. On days when bronze casting took place nearby, the scent grew sharper. Smoke, soot, and fire. But this was no romantic scene. It was laborious, exhausting, and at times dangerous. Eyes stung from dust. Hands blistered and bled. Stone chips flew like knives. One careless moment could scar a face or shatter a toe. The sun beat down through open skylights, and in summer, the air inside turned stifling. In winter, it grew damp, every tool freezing to the touch. Yet no one complained, not loudly anyway. To be here to be part of the process was a privilege. When midday came, the sculptors took a break. Lunch was simple bread, olives, figs, goat cheese, and wine diluted with water. They ate in the shade, sitting on overturned crates or stone blocks. Conversations drifted from politics to poetry, from temple gossip to philosophical questions about proportion and divinity. Occasionally, a storyteller would recite verses from Homer or Hesiod, drawing murmurs of approval between bites of food. Sometimes laughter echoed louder than the chisels. Then they returned to work, dusting off their hands, dipping rags into water, checking the model again. The heat didn't stop them. Neither did the pain. One assistant, missing 3 fingers, still worked the polishing stone with his remaining hand, faster and smoother than anyone else. Another, with a back hunched from years of leaning over stone-carved folds of drapery with the grace of a poet. In this space, injury didn't end a career, it became part of the sculptor's story. As the afternoon light began to soften, the workshop shifted into a quieter rhythm. The final hours were delicate fine detailing, gentle polishing, subtle corrections. Mistakes were costly now. Every stroke had to be intentional. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Some sculptors whispered prayers under their breath, asking Athena or Hephaestus to guide their hand. Others simply focused jaw-clenched, body still, as if afraid to breathe too hard. And when the light began to fade, the day ended, not with celebration, but with cleaning. Apprentices swept assistants, packed tools, and the master walked one final circuit, his eyes scanning each statue, each face, each unfinished gesture. He made mental notes for tomorrow. Sometimes he'd place a hand on the marble as if reassuring it, or himself. Night fell. The workshop emptied, leaving behind the echo of hammers, the smell of stone, and the slow, silent breath of unfinished gods. In these places, dusty, loud, hot, and sacred, the sculptor lived his life. He did not seek fame, though some achieved it. He did not chase immortality, though some found it. What he sought was something simpler, something purer, to shape what the world could not see, to carve truth from silence, to give memory to matter. And day after day, with cracked hands and aching shoulders, he did just that. The final day arrived with little ceremony. After months, sometimes years of carving, polishing, correcting, and praying, the statue stood ready. Not every wrinkle had been smoothed, not every detail was perfect, but the time had come. Outside the workshop, the city stirred. Inside, the sculptor and his team gathered around the figure in silence, as if standing at the edge of something holy. They had lived with this statue longer than they had lived with some friends. They knew its weight, its scars, its personality. And now they had to let it go. There was no question of whether it was finished. It had begun to breathe. Transporting a sculpture was a monumental task in itself. Ropes, pulleys, wagons, and manpower were assembled with precision. Depending on the size of the statue and its final location moving, it could take hours or days. Crowds gathered to watch. Children followed in packs. Women peeked from doorways. For the average citizen, it was a rare thrill to witness the birth of a public monument, to see marble rise and roll through narrow streets like a silent god passing through their world. Sometimes the statue was draped in cloth, veiled until the moment of its unveiling. Sometimes it was displayed in full, its gleaming surface catching sunlight and turning heads. Regardless of the method, the procession always felt sacred. Musicians played flutes and lyres. Incense wafted through the air. Priests walked alongside, chanting or murmuring blessings. It was not just a delivery, it was a rite of passage, both for the statue and for the people it would now face forever. The final destination varied. Some statues were destined for temples, where they would stand behind rows of columns, bathed in the filtered glow of votive candles and shafts of morning light. Others were placed in public squares, or agoras meant to be admired, argued over, even used as landmarks. Some were grave markers set within the quiet of a cemetery garden to honor the dead with eternal dignity. And a rare few were installed in private homes, symbols of wealth and personal taste, set in courtyards or entry halls to impress visitors and proclaim cultural sophistication. But regardless of setting, the moment of unveiling was always electric. The sculptor, often standing in the background, watched nervously as cloth was lifted or as the statue came into full view. The first gasps from the crowd were everything. Admiration, confusion, awe, even criticism, all of it washed over the artist in waves. He had lived in solitude with the form, tweaking every line, every expression. Now it belonged to others. And once seen, it could never be unseen. His work, his name, his choices all frozen in public judgment. When the statue was of a deity, the stakes were even higher. The presence of priests was mandatory. Offerings were made fruit wine animals. Incense was burned. A ritual dedication took place, often including hymns and invocations. A priest might smear oil on the statue's lips or eyes to awaken it symbolically, inviting the spirit of the god to inhabit the form. In some cases, sacred jewelry or robes were added, transforming the marble figure into a living idol. The crowd would bow, clap, or chant. Some wept. Others whispered prayers. The statue was no longer stone, it was presence. It was divinity in form. If the figure honored a victorious athlete, a fallen hero, or a great philosopher, the ceremony leaned more towards civic pride. Speeches were given, recounting the person's deeds or virtues. Family members stood nearby, flushed with emotion. Artists were sometimes called forward to speak, though many declined, preferring the statue to speak for itself. Wine flowed, toasts were raised, and when the sun hit just right, casting shadows over the statue's cheekbones or along the folds of its robe, the crowd would fall silent, struck by something they couldn't name. This was the goal of the sculptor, not merely beauty, but timelessness. To create a figure that stood beyond the moment, that looked not like a man or woman, but like the idea of one, something pure, something unreachable. Greek sculpture did not chase realism for its own sake. It sought the ideal, the perfect balance of body, spirit, and meaning. And in these moments of unveiling, the ideal became real, if only for a heartbeat. But not all reactions were applause. Some sculptures were controversial. A nude Aphrodite might stir lust and outrage. A crooked nose or an unconventional pose could ignite debates among philosophers. Was it too human? Too arrogant? Was the statue meant to flatter the patron or to provoke the gods? Public sculpture in Greece was political, religious, and cultural all at once. A misstep could be costly. Sculptors walked a fine line between genius and hubris. There were stories, some whispered, some recorded, of sculptors whose work offended the wrong people. Statues defaced in the night. Artists accused of impiety. Works torn down by mobs or quietly removed by embarrassed patrons. But more often, the statue endured. The people grew used to it. The face once shocking became familiar. Children used it as a meeting spot. Philosophers quoted it in lectures. It was included in festivals, in poems, in memory. And the sculptor, he would walk by now and then unnoticed, watching the way the statue caught rain or shadow. He might nod, might smile, or might curse the flaw only he could see. But he would not touch it again. It was done. It was no longer his. In time, some statues became icons. The chryselephantine statue of Athena inside the Parthenon towered in gold and ivory eyes, gazing into eternity. Zeus at Olympia, one of the seven wonders, sat calm, and enormous thunderbolt in hand. Pilgrims came from across the Greek world to see them, to offer prayers, to stand in awe. These were not just statues. They were experiences. They were beliefs made visible. And yet, even the smaller, simpler statues held power. A grave stele showing a father saying farewell to his daughter. A bust of a philosopher carved in thoughtful stillness. A bronze boy playing with a bird. These works moved people not because they were grand, but because they were true. They captured something deep, unspoken, and universal. And that, more than technique or material, was the heart of Greek sculpture, the ability to touch the eternal through the familiar. Years later, when the sculptor was gone, and his name half remembered, the statue remained. Weathered by time, chipped by war, faded by sun, but still standing. A fragment of a moment. A silent witness. And as long as someone stood before it, pondering, admiring, or simply wondering, the sculptor still spoke. Not in words, not in shouts, but in stone. Stone was eternal, yes, but bronze could move. If marble was the body, bronze was the breath. It gleamed under sunlight, danced with firelight, and gave sculptors a language of motion that stone could never quite match. In a culture that celebrated athleticism, heroism, and divinity, bronze became the material of choice when the human form needed not just to be seen, but to live. It allowed for open arms, extended limbs, twisting torsos, dynamic poses that defied gravity and reached into space. Bronze didn't just stand, it lunged, it flew, it leapt into memory. But sculpting in bronze was nothing like working in marble. Where marble demanded patience and precision, bronze demanded courage and calculation. The process was longer, messier, and infinitely more dangerous. It required not just vision, but fire, literal, roaring, unforgiving fire. And at the heart of it all was a mystery that even today we call lost wax casting, an ancient alchemy that transformed wax into metal and breathless models into gods. It began once again with clay. The sculptor would shape the figure in soft earth, building it piece by piece until the form stood complete. This model wasn't just a sketch, it was the real thing, full size and rich in detail. Over that clay, a thin layer of wax was applied, sometimes smoothed with fingers, sometimes shaped with tiny tools to create folds of skin, strands of hair, or subtle gestures. This wax layer would eventually disappear, but before it did, it held the artist's touch more faithfully than any chisel ever could. Once satisfied, the sculptor and his assistants covered the wax-coated figure in a shell of clay, thick and strong, leaving vents and channels carefully designed for air and molten metal to pass through. This shell, called the investment, would be dried in the sun or baked near a furnace until it hardened like rock. Then came the critical moment. The entire piece was heated over fire, melting the wax from within. The wax dripped away through the vents, leaving behind a hollow cavity in the exact shape of the original figure. It was here, in this delicate vacuum, that the soul of the statue waited to be born. The furnaces blazed. Men in soaked linen wrappings and leather aprons stoked the fire with bellows, feeding it charcoal and breath. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was melted in crucibles, glowing red, then orange, then white-hot. The air around the foundry shimmered. The noise was deafening. Crackling flames, the whoosh of air, the hiss of metal licking stone. Temperatures climbed past 1,000 degrees Celsius. A mistake here could cost more than just the statue, it could cost a life. And then, at just the right moment, they poured. Molten bronze, glowing like the sun, flowed into the mold. It rushed through the channels, filled the emptiness, left by the wax, embraced every crevice, every curve. The pouring was a sacred act, watched in silence or with whispered prayers. If the metal cooled too fast, it cracked. If the mold wasn't sealed, it leaked. If air was trapped inside, bubbles formed flaws that might never be fixed. It was a dance with chaos, performed in heat and hope. After pouring, the statue was left to cool. Not for minutes, but for days. Bronze didn't harden quickly. It shrank as it cooled, settled into itself. Once cool, the outer mold was carefully broken away, chipped with hammers, peeled with chisels. And what emerged was both wonder and mess, a rough bronze form still coated in soot with protruding casting channels, spurs, and imperfections. It was not yet beautiful, but it was alive. Now came the chasing, a process of refinement. Sculptors filed down seams, patched holes, added texture. In some cases, missing parts like hands, weapons, or facial details were cast separately and welded on. The joints were blended seamlessly. Hammering, engraving, polishing, all were done with devotion. The surface was smoothed, then burnished with pumice or stone. Sometimes chemicals were applied to induce patina's colors that ranged from rich greens to browns, and even golden hues, depending on the elements used. The result wasn't just a statue. It was a living surface, one that aged, oxidized, changed with the seasons. Details made bronze special. Because it was stronger than stone, it could hold incredibly fine features, taut muscles, curled toes, fluttering drapery, the glint of teeth. Eyes in particular were a triumph. Sculptors often inlaid them with bone glass or ivory to create an uncanny realism. Pupils could be made of obsidian or onyx. Eyelashes were sometimes etched lips subtly darkened. When a viewer stood before a finished bronze figure, they didn't just see it, they felt it looking back. But bronze had a darker fate. Unlike marble, which shattered but remained bronze, could be melted and reborn as something else. In times of war or crisis, statues were among the first to be sacrificed. Pillaged cities saw their bronze figures chopped, broken, smelted into sword shields or coins. The same statue that once honored a god might return as a spearhead in battle. This brutal cycle meant that while thousands of bronze sculptures were made, only a handful survive today. What we have, like the Rhais warriors, the charioteer of Delphi, or the Artemision bronze, are survivors of fire and fate, pulled from shipwrecks, buried in ruins, hidden from destruction by accident or miracle. And yet, in their survival, they show us the boldest dreams of the Greek sculptor. These weren't passive frozen images. They were dynamic, psychological, expressive. A twist of the torso, a furrowed brow, a warrior mid-stride, a youth reaching into space. Bronze allowed the artist to explore narrative in motion, to hint at a moment before or after the present, to suspend time. Working in bronze was not for the faint-hearted. It demanded resources, teamwork, and infrastructure. Quarries weren't needed, but furnaces were. Labor was intense. Accidents were common. And unlike marble, bronze did not forgive. A flaw in the cast could ruin everything. There were no do-overs, no smoothing over a cracked mold. And yet, the rewards were immense. A successful bronze statue was a marvel, a sensation, an event. In large city-states, bronze sculptors were revered. They built statues for Olympians' monuments to victories and portraits of philosophers and politicians. Some even made automata, moving statues powered by heat or air part machine part miracle. These works blurred the line between technology and art, science and divinity. They made people question what was real, what was imagined, what was human, and what was God. And still, through all the fire and effort, the sculptor returned again and again to the forge. He chose bronze not because it was easy, but because it was alive. It carried breath, it held stories, and it whispered of permanence even as it threatened disappearance. Bronze was not just a material, it was a challenge, a temptation, a promise. And those who dared to master it became more than artisans. They became conjurers of light and metal, builders of gods, and dreamers in fire, long after the fires of the foundries cooled. Long after the last echo of a chisel faded from stone, their names remained. Not many, of course. Most sculptors were anonymous, their masterpieces signed only by style or buried with time. But a few carved their identities into the very bones of history. These were the ones who didn't just shape statues. They shaped civilization's sense of beauty, of balance, of what it meant to be human and divine. In a world that often favored warriors and kings, they were craftsmen whose works outlived empires. Their legacy was not written in ink, but in marble and bronze. At the pinnacle of this pantheon stood Phidias, the master sculptor of the classical age. He wasn't merely an artisan, he was an architect of awe. Born in Athens around 480 BCE, Phidias became the artistic hand behind the golden age of Pericles, helping transform Athens into a beacon of culture and splendor. His most legendary works: the colossal statue of Athena Parthenos inside the Parthenon and the giant seated Zeus at Olympia were not just sculptures, they were revelations. Both were crafted using the chryselephantine technique, blending gold and ivory over wooden cores, standing dozens of feet tall and radiating divine majesty. To see the Athena Parthenos was to stand in the presence of a protector. She towered within her temple, helmeted armed yet serene, her shield etched with mythological battles, her palm bearing the winged figure of Nike. Phidias didn't just create a goddess. He created an ideological symbol of Athens, wise, powerful, victorious, and civil. His Zeus at Olympia was so overwhelming in scale and beauty that ancient viewers swore it changed their lives. If Zeus were to appear before men, the saying went, he would appear as Phidias made him. That statue would later be counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a testament not only to its grandeur, but to its emotional power. But Phidias was not without enemies. His close association with Pericles, his visibility and his fame, attracted jealousy and suspicion. Accused of embezzling ivory and impiety, some say politically motivated charges, he was imprisoned and likely died behind bars. Yet his reputation endured. His influence on sculpture architecture and artistic values echoed across the centuries, setting a standard for the divine form that later cultures from Rome to the Renaissance would try to match. If Phidias gave the gods their grandeur, Polykleitos gave humans their harmony. A sculptor from Argos, he worked in bronze and became famous not only for his statues, but for his treatise known as the Canon, a theoretical text outlining the mathematical proportions of the ideal human body. His philosophy was simple, yet revolutionary. Beauty came from symmetry and balance, from ratio and rhythm. He believed that the perfect statue could be created by following a system of measurements, like a formula for physical truth. His most famous work, the Doraphoros Spear Bearer, embodies this philosophy. The figure stands relaxed yet alert in a stance known as contrapposto, where the weight shifts naturally onto one leg, creating a subtle S-curve in the torso. This was a radical departure from the stiff frontal poses of earlier periods. In Polykleitos's hands, the human body became a poem in equilibrium, powerful yet poised, masculine yet graceful. His influence shaped generations of sculptors, and his ideas about proportion fed directly into later theories of beauty in Roman art and Renaissance anatomy. While Phidias and Polykleitos worked in grandeur and theory, Praxiteles brought sculpture closer to the human heart. Active in the 4th century BCE, he was the sculptor of intimacy, of softness, of sensuality. His works were less about ideal forms and more about capturing moments, quiet, vulnerable, sometimes playful. He was the first to sculpt the goddess Aphrodite nude, a bold move that shocked some and enchanted others. His Aphrodite of Cnidos became one of the most famous statues of antiquity, drawing pilgrims and lovers to the city just to catch a glimpse. Praxiteles' genius was in the details, the tilt of a head, the softness of a belly, the way a figure leaned or gazed off into the distance. His Hermas with the infant Dionysus survives in part today, and still conveys a gentle, almost fatherly tenderness rarely seen in earlier works. He wasn't just shaping stone, he was suggesting mood, emotion, and even narrative. In a culture that often favored abstraction or idealization, Praxiteles made the gods feel real close, almost touchable. And then there was Lysippos, the personal sculptor of Alexander the Great, who pushed Greek sculpture into a new era toward realism and individuality. He claimed to have sculpted more portraits of Alexander than anyone else, portraying him not just as a conqueror, but as a thinker, a god, a visionary. Lysippos abandoned the strict proportions of Polykleitos, opting instead for slimmer, taller figures, heads turned, gazes lifted, bodies in motion. His statues seemed caught mid-thought, mid-step, mid-life. Though most of his originals are lost, Roman copies survive, and his influence is unmistakable. He helped set the stage for the Hellenistic period, where emotion, action, and drama would take center stage. These 4, Phidias, Polykleitos, Praxiteles, Lysippos, were not just artists. They were philosophers in stone, each with a different vision of what sculpture could be. Where one saw gods, another saw athletes. Where one measured beauty, another felt it. They lived in different cities, different generations, but their works formed a dialogue across time, a sculptural symphony of balance, boldness, grace, and fire. But they were not alone. Dozens of other sculptors, though lesser known, left profound marks. Praxiteles, who sculpted the noble portrait of Pericles in his helmeted dignity. Sculptor, whose works burned with intensity and raw pathos. Myron, whose discobolus discus thrower captured a fleeting moment of athletic perfection, frozen at the height of tension. These artists continued to refine, challenge, and expand what sculpture could express, not just form, but psychology, story, humanity. And then, beyond names, beyond fame, were the hundreds, no thousands of anonymous sculptors who worked in regional temples, family workshops, or remote sanctuaries. Their hands shaped statues of lesser-known deities, votive offerings, funerary steles, public monuments. Their work was rarely signed, often uncelebrated, but just as vital. They were the spine of the tradition, the keepers of craft. Their legacy survives not in history books, but in broken torsos, headless busts, weathered reliefs, quiet, enduring proof of lives spent in pursuit of form. Together, these sculptors, great and unknown, gave ancient Greece a visual language that extended beyond borders. Their influence reached Rome, where Greek originals were copied obsessively. It reached the Renaissance, where artists like Michelangelo and Donatello studied their forms to rediscover human potential. It reached modernity, where museums from London to Berlin to New York still fight to display their works, fragments though they may be. They didn't just make statues, they taught generations how to see, how to feel proportion, to read silence, to listen to posture and gaze. And in doing so, they made stone eternal. For centuries, the statues stood still, silent and divine. They watched over temples, guarded city gates, marked the resting places of the dead. Their marble skin gleamed under the Mediterranean sun. Their bronze limbs shimmered like living fire. Generations passed beneath their gaze. Lovers kissed in their shadows. Warriors prayed before them. Children ran their fingers along the folds of carved robes and wondered if the gods were really made of stone. These figures weren't just art, they were part of the rhythm of daily life woven into the identity of the Greek world. But even stone weathers, even bronze corrodes. And the world around them began to change. The decline came slowly, at first like a shadow stretching across the afternoon. As internal strife weakened the Greek city-states and new powers rose to the west, art became less a matter of sacred duty and more a symbol of past glory. Then came the Romans, not destroyers of Greek culture, but obsessive collectors. They revered Greek sculpture, copied it en masse, imported originals to Rome, to adorn their villas, baths, and forums. Greek sculptors were hired to fill Roman demands, often reproducing the same statue dozens of times for different clients. A new industry was born, replication, not revelation. But even in imitation, something survived. Greek ideals of proportion, beauty, and form became the visual foundation of the Roman Empire. Through Roman eyes, Greek sculpture continued to influence architecture, law, governance, everything that claimed the mantle of civilization. And yet, as the centuries turned and empires crumbled, so too did the reverence for what had once been sacred. By the time Christianity swept through the Mediterranean world, the gods of marble and bronze were no longer worshipped. They were blasphemy. Statues of Zeus and Athena were not seen as masterpieces, but as idols, false deities to be destroyed or defaced. Pagan temples were repurposed or razed. Sculptures were beheaded. Their arms hacked off their bodies, toppled and buried beneath churches. The ivory and gold of chryselephantine statues were stripped, melted, sold. In some places, entire workshops were dismantled, not because their craft was unwanted, but because the stories they told no longer fit the new world. Others simply disappeared. Earthquakes, floods, fires, acts of man and nature buried entire cities and sanctuaries beneath layers of soil. Over time, grass grew over stone villages, rose over ruins, and the memory of sculptors faded into myth. Some statues were thrown into wells to hide them. Others were used as building material marble, crushed into lime bronze, melted into weapons. The human form once celebrated was now feared. For over 1,000 years, the art of ancient Greek sculpture lay dormant, whispering from the dark, waiting to be seen again. It wasn't until the Renaissance, that great rebirth of human curiosity, that the stones began to speak once more. In the 15th century, as artists in Florence and Rome sought inspiration beyond church walls, they turned to the ruins buried beneath their feet. Statues were unearthed torsos, half buried in vineyards, heads recovered from riverbeds. Collectors, scholars, and artists began to piece together the forgotten world of the Greeks. They didn't just find beauty, they found philosophy, mathematics, humanity carved into every figure. Michelangelo studied the Laocoon. Raphael drew inspiration from Praxiteles. Donatello revived bronze casting in the spirit of Lysippos. These masters of the Renaissance didn't just admire Greek sculpture, they saw it as truth rediscovered. The ancient sculptors became silent mentors to a new generation of genius. And slowly across Europe, the broken fragments of Greece were gathered, catalogued, and displayed, first in private collections, then in museums that drew pilgrims of a different kind. Students, travelers, lovers of beauty. But this rediscovery was not always pure. European powers, in their hunger for ancient prestige, began to remove Greek sculpture from its homeland. The 18th and 19th centuries saw a frenzy of excavation and appropriation. The Elgin marbles taken from the Parthenon and now housed in the British Museum remain a source of international controversy. Other masterpieces ended up in the Louvre. The Vatican, the Met, scattered across the globe like puzzle pieces of a lost world. Greece was left with wounds, its gods exiled, its stories exported. And yet, even in exile, the statues endured. They spoke to modern eyes not as religious icons or national trophies, but as mirrors. We saw in them not just mythology, but ourselves, our potential, our struggle, our elegance, our imperfection. We marveled at how hands could shape stone to suggest breath, how bronze could bend to emotion. We began to understand that Greek sculpture was not frozen. It was eternally in motion, not physically, but culturally. Reshaping the way we view the body, the soul, the very act of creation. Today, we live in a world of endless images of digital avatars and 3D renderings, but Greek sculpture still commands attention. School children learn to draw the Discobolus. Architects borrow lines from Ionic columns. Fashion designers imitate the drapery of caryatids. And in museums, people stand quietly before ancient figures, not because they believe in Apollo or Hera, but because something about these forms feels timeless. They are old, yes, but never outdated. In recent years, scholars and curators have begun to reconstruct not just the forms of these statues, but their colors, their contexts, their voices. We now know that most Greek statues were painted vibrant, colorful, almost theatrical. Far from the pale white we once believed was ideal, the ancient world was full of pigments, patterns, and life. The gods were not cold, they were alive with color, sound, meaning. And we are only beginning to understand them. Yet perhaps the most moving rediscovery is not academic, it is emotional. To stand before a statue that was carved over 2,000 years ago is to feel a pulse beneath the stone. Not just the pulse of the figure, but of the sculptor, long gone unnamed, but somehow present. You see his choices, his errors, his genius. You imagine his hands stained and cracked. You hear the echo of his workshop, the rasp of a file, the breath held before the final strike. You remember that art is not made by gods, but by people who dare to make gods real. And so the story of Greek sculpture does not end in ruin. It ends in revival, in reverence, in the realization that no statue is ever truly silent, no stone ever truly dead. Because as long as someone looks with wonder, with curiosity, with care, the sculpture lives. In the dust of the past, we find not just fragments of stone, but fragments of ourselves. And through the sculptor's craft, we are reminded that time may erode the body, but it cannot erase the touch. From broken marble to gleaming bronze, from dusty workshops to the grand halls of modern museums, ancient Greek sculptors gave form to eternity. Their hands may be lost to time, but their work still speaks across centuries. If this journey through their world moved you, inspired you, or simply made you pause and reflect, consider giving this video a like. Subscribe for more deep dives into forgotten stories, lost civilizations, and the art that shaped our very humanity. And remember, every statue is more than stone. It is memory. It is legacy. It is life preserved in silence.